Around a year or so ago, you might have heard something or other about Manifest v3 and how it was the upcoming update to Google Chrome and, by extension, Chromium-based browsers that would lead users into a new age of security online. And, at least to me back then, I kind of gave it a right, that's kind of cool, I guess, and then moved on. After all, I've been using Firefox for years, so I didn't really care all that much. But more recently, within the past few months or so, I've seen an uptick in news articles and posts about Manifest v3 and its consequences, especially since Chrome dropped support for its predecessor, Manifest v2, mid to late last year. Essentially, Manifest v3 fundamentally changes the way web extensions interact with the browser. Think uBlock Origin, or quite literally any other web extension for Chrome or most Chromium-based browsers. Manifest v3 makes these extensions functionally, well, kind of moronic when compared to how they used to work under Manifest v2. For a few years after Google announced they were working on implementing Manifest v3 as the sole web extension standard within Chrome/Chromium, they continued support for v2 extensions as well. This was how extensions like uBlock and other similar web extensions were able to continue to function for a time, even though these Chromium-based browsers were being updated with v3 in mind. Nevertheless, as I stated at the beginning of this video, v2 support was dropped mid last year. Developers were no longer free to dynamically modify elements within extensions without having to issue a full web extension application update to Chrome and await their review and confirmation to push the update to end users. This is a really important ability for extensions like web page element blockers/ad blockers, like everyone's favourite uBlock Origin, to be able to utilise. And I'm using uBlock as a repeated example because it was the most affected out of the top web extensions. uBlock actively intercepted your network traffic via the Web Request API within Chromium to filter out not only network requests that went to sketchy sites that would have been on a uBlock filter list, but also to block certain cookies, redirect traffic, and stop your user agent from being sent to whichever server you were being connected to. This was possible because Chromium-based browsers would pass the newly generated request object, which is basically a generated file containing the information the user wants to pass to the server. It would pass this to uBlock before it was ultimately sent to the server. This gave uBlock the ability to go through the file and yoink anything it didn't like or wouldn't want the server to receive. This was really good for us users. Nobody wants to watch a 30-second non-skippable ad on YouTube or be overrun with floating advertisements when going to a mainstream news media website, but Google didn't see it as a safety tool. Rather, they saw it more as a drain on their wallet, because who just so happens to operate the internet's largest advertisement facilitator? Oh yes, Google. So, as you would assume from this information, Google was very keen on using any excuse possible to get rid of this financial burden and begin reaping those ad viewership profits. And by using security as the excuse to implement the changes the way they did, as well as halt support for Manifest v2, they could cap the usefulness of ad/web element blockers by limiting how dynamic they could behave. But what does that exactly mean? I think the best way to put this without going into too much detail, because my brain is very small, is that v2 allowed web extensions to be imperative, whereas v3 mandated web extensions behave in a declarative way, i.e. v2 allowed too much free rein to web extensions in the eyes of Google, and they needed to be reined in. These extensions could execute code, and in the case of uBlock, act as a man-in-the-middle piece of software between the user and the server they are connecting to. Google's argument for shooting extensions in the metaphorical kneecaps was to prevent the possibility of malicious extensions from having access to such power over the user. And what was the result? More opaque web extensions that can still be malicious and just as badly, but without affording the user the ability to install extensions to as prevalently modify incoming network packets as before. As a consequence of Google's actions, the team behind uBlock have been forced to make do with uBlock Lite, which is a completely lobotomized version of uBlock Origin, but is unfortunately the best one can do with the new restrictions placed upon them. Not being able to dynamically update, etc., without having to submit an entirely new version to Google's extension store to await their confirmation that, yes, you are allowed to update your extension, but this isn't where the story ends. Far from it, because, as you might know, there are a few up-to-date Chromium-based browsers that do in fact still block unwanted things like ads on websites, including YouTube, pretty effectively. browsers like Brave and Opera/OperaGX. Now, why is this? Haven't I just been rambling on for the past few minutes about how Google has essentially killed the ability for users to be able to install, develop, or otherwise utilize ad blocking software on their browser like uBlock Origin? Yes, but the devil is in the detail, my friends. Manifest v3 is the demon here. Modern Chromium-based browsers support it, including Brave and Opera. However, the difference is that these two browsers, specifically, have actually partially forked the Chromium codebase in order to maintain the now legacy v2, as well as patch the new upstream v3 updates into their browsers themselves. They haven't begun developing a completely separate version of Chromium, but they take the updates Chromium provides to users regarding v3 and patch it into their own version, as to keep support for Manifest v2 alive, whilst also supporting v3 at least for now. Aside from the continued support for Manifest v2, OperaGX and Brave both actually include ad and other sketchy stuff blocking software within the browser itself without having to rely on v2 extensions, essentially bypassing Google's imposed v3 restrictions. However, there is an important caveat here regarding Brave. Brave seems to have gone down a slightly different path when compared to Opera in terms of v2 support, and actually only provides support for 4 specific v2 extensions, those being uBlock Origin, AdGuard, NoScript, and uMatrix. After Google Chrome removed these from the web extension store, Brave now hosts them on their own servers and maintains support for them for Brave browser users. These seem to be the only v2 extensions that Brave actively support and maintains support for, at least in the near future. It seems the more complex and the more changes Google makes to the Chromium source code, the more and more difficult it is going to be for these maintainers to be able to, well, maintain support for v2. The sun is definitely setting on v2 support for Chromium-based browsers as a whole. But what about Firefox and Firefox-based browsers? Well, if you couldn't have guessed, essentially it goes how you would think. Because Firefox isn't Chromium-based, they're just free to do what they want. And as of 2026, Mozilla have stated that they will continue to support Manifest v2 in the future, with their own implementation of v3 going much differently to how Google implemented it. i.e. the Firefox implementation of v3 allows the web extensions to be imperative/dynamic in how they are updated and how they operate. They are free to analyze incoming web traffic as they please, with no v3 specific restrictions on what they can and can't do. Much of this video focused on uBlock Origin simply because of how popular and useful of a web extension it is/was, depending on if you're a Chromium user or Google Chrome user or not. It not only blocks known malicious sites, but sketchy downloads, pop-ups, advertisements, and even certain web elements you as the user want blocking. It's a good extension that everyone should use. It's a shame Google seem hell-bent on forcing an internet that no one asked for down our throats. But to give you the ultimate Redditor TLDR rundown, don't use Chrome or Chromium-based browsers, use Firefox. My distaste for OperaGX and Brave can be found on my channel, I think, somewhere. Thank you for watching, subscribe if you enjoyed, and I'll see you in my next video.